The Boeing 747 shuddered through turbulence at 37,000 feet, its passengers oblivious to the crisis unfolding in the cockpit. Captain Morrison's hands trembled as he stared at the instrument panel, watching hydraulic pressure drop to zero. The massive airliner, carrying 412 souls from Los Angeles to Tokyo, had become a flying coffin. In the passenger cabin, a young woman in seat 17A glanced up from her paperback novel, her trained ears detecting the subtle change in engine pitch that others missed. Lieutenant Colonel Alexandra Viper Reeves had been flying combat missions over Afghanistan just 6 months ago. Now, at 28, she was on her first civilian flight in 3 years, trying to forget the sound of her wingman's last transmission before his F-16 disappeared into a mountain ridge. The airline ticket in her pocket was one way to Tokyo, where she planned to disappear into teaching English and never touch aircraft controls again. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Flying's in your blood, Alex. You can't just walk away." She had proven him wrong by resigning her commission after the investigation cleared her of any wrongdoing in Lieutenant Hayes' death. The aircraft lurched violently, throwing passengers against their seatbelts. Viper's muscle memory kicked in as she analyzed the aircraft's behavior. The nose was dropping too quickly, the engine spooling down in a pattern she recognized from emergency procedures. Through her window, she spotted two F-22 Raptors maintaining formation 500 yards off the port wing, their sleek profiles cutting through the afternoon sky like chrome daggers. Their presence meant this wasn't just mechanical failure. In the cockpit, Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the radio to Los Angeles Control. "Mayday, Mayday, United 774 declaring emergency. Complete hydraulic failure, losing altitude, unable to maintain flight path." The response came through static. "United 774, you're cleared direct to Edwards Air Force Base. Military escort is in position." Morrison looked at his co-pilot, whose face had gone pale. They both knew Edwards was 200 miles away, and their aircraft was dropping like a stone with no way to control the flight surfaces. The Raptors moved closer, their pilots studying the crippled airliner. Major Jake "Razor" Williams, leading the formation, spoke into his oxygen mask. "Tower, this is Razor 11. Commercial aircraft appears to have complete flight control failure. Recommend immediate vector to nearest suitable runway." His wingman, Captain Lisa "Phoenix" Chen, adjusted her position to get a better view of the 747's condition. Neither pilot knew that their solution was sitting in seat 17A, reading a romance novel, trying to forget she had once been the youngest pilot to achieve ace status in modern combat, and that her call sign, Viper, was earned by pulling off impossible saves that other pilots called suicidal. The 747 continued its inexorable descent toward the Pacific Ocean, its passengers still unaware that their survival depended on whether a broken veteran could find the courage to fly again. Morrison's hands moved frantically over the controls, but the aircraft refused to respond. The yoke felt like it was connected to nothing, the rudder pedals useless. His 23 years of commercial flying experience meant nothing when physics took over from piloting skills. The altimeter spun downward past 35,000 feet. Through the cockpit windows, the ocean's surface grew larger with each passing second. In seat 17A, Viper closed her book and unfastened her seatbelt. The flight attendant, a nervous woman in her 40s, hurried past with oxygen masks in her hands, preparing for the announcement that would send 400 people into panic. Viper caught her arm gently. "Ma'am, I need you to get me to the cockpit. I'm military aircrew." The attendant looked at her skeptically, seeing only a young woman in jeans and a UCLA sweatshirt. "Miss, please return to your seat and fasten your seatbelt." "Listen to me carefully," Viper said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions. "This aircraft has lost hydraulic pressure. In approximately 4 minutes, we're going to hit the ocean unless someone who understands flight dynamics gets to those controls. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Alexandra Reeves, call sign Viper, and I've landed damaged aircraft before." The attendant's eyes widened as she processed the transformation in the woman before her. Through her headset, Major Williams heard the radio chatter from Edwards Air Force Base. "Razor flight. Be advised we're tracking the aircraft's descent rate. At current trajectory, impact in 6 minutes. Are you able to provide assistance?" Williams felt the familiar weight of helplessness that came with watching people die while being powerless to intervene. The F-22's weapon systems were useless here, its speed and maneuverability meaningless against mechanical failure. "Tower, negative on direct assistance. We're escorts only. Commercial aircraft appears to have no flight control authority." He paused, watching the 747's nose drop another few degrees. "Request any available emergency procedures for complete hydraulic failure on Boeing 747. The silence that followed told him everything he needed to know. There were no procedures for what they were witnessing. Inside the cockpit, Morrison noticed the flight attendant approaching with a passenger. His first instinct was to refuse entry, but something in the young woman's posture made him pause. She moved through the narrow aisle with the precise, economical movements of someone trained to navigate cramped spaces under pressure. Her eyes swept the instrument panel with professional assessment, taking in the hydraulic indicators, altitude, airspeed, and engine parameters in seconds. "Captain, my name is Alex Reeves. I'm Air Force fixed-wing pilot. How long since you lost hydraulics?" Morrison stared at her, processing the impossibility of military aircrew sitting in his passenger cabin. "About 3 minutes. We've got nothing. No elevator control, no aileron authority, rudders not responding." Viper's mind raced through emergency procedures she had memorized years ago, scenarios drilled into every military pilot's consciousness. The aircraft shuddered again, more violently this time, as it entered an increasingly steep dive. Morrison moved aside as Viper slid into the right seat, her hands instinctively finding the familiar positions of throttles and trim controls. The 747's cockpit was vastly different from her F-16, but the basic principles of flight remained constant. She scanned the engine instruments, noting that all 4 turbofans were still producing power. That meant she had one option that civilian pilots rarely considered: using differential thrust to maintain some semblance of control. "Captain, I need you to help me with the throttles. When I call out engine numbers, you adjust power exactly as I say. No hesitation, no second guessing." Morrison nodded, his 23 years of experience telling him to trust the calm confidence in this young woman's voice. Through the cockpit windows, the F-22s maintained their formation, their pilots unaware that the situation had just changed. Viper keyed the radio microphone. "Edwards Tower, this is Lieutenant Colonel Alexandra Reeves speaking from United 774 cockpit. I'm taking flight control using thrust differential. Request clearance direct to Edwards, vectors as needed, and emergency equipment standing by." The silence on the frequency lasted several seconds before the tower controller responded. "United 774, confirm you have qualified aircrew now at the controls." "Affirmative, Edwards. Air Force pilot, call sign Viper, assuming control." In his F-22, Major Williams felt something change in his chest. Every military pilot knew that call sign. The woman who had earned it flying over Kandahar, pulling off aerial maneuvers that instructors now used as case studies in advanced fighter tactics. Stories about Viper had circulated through pilot training programs for years. Tales of impossible saves and aerial combat victories that bordered on legendary. Williams keyed his radio. "Edwards Tower, Razor 11, can confirm Viper's reputation. You've got the best stick-and rudder pilot in the Air Force up there." He paused, watching the 747's descent begin to stabilize. "Ma'am, Razor Flight is honored to escort you home." Viper's response came through with mechanical precision. "Copy, Razor Flight. Let's bring these people home alive." She placed her hands on the throttle quadrant, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. 412 people were depending on skills she had tried to forget, techniques developed in combat zones where failure meant death. The ocean below looked calm and infinitely patient, waiting to claim another aircraft and its passengers. Through differential engine thrust, she began the delicate process of turning the crippled airliner toward Edwards Air Force Base, one small victory at a time. The Boeing 747 responded sluggishly to Viper's inputs, its massive weight fighting every attempt at control. She reduced power to engines 1 and 4 while increasing thrust on 2 and 3, feeling the aircraft begin a shallow right turn toward Edwards. The technique required absolute precision, too much differential, and the aircraft would enter an unrecoverable spin, too little, and they would continue their descent into the Pacific. "Altitude 32,000 feet and stabilizing," Morrison called out, his voice carrying newfound hope. In the passenger cabin, people began to sense something had changed. The screaming dive had become a controlled descent. The aircraft's nose no longer pointed toward certain death. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, preparing passengers for what they believed would be their final minutes. Major Williams adjusted his position to get a better view of the airliner's condition. The 747 was flying in a slight nose-down attitude, but its descent rate had decreased dramatically. Through his headset, he heard Edwards Tower coordinating the emergency response. All emergency vehicles to runway 25 right. Medical teams standing by. Clear all other traffic from Edwards airspace. The base was transforming into a massive rescue operation, every available resource focused on the incoming aircraft. Viper's voice remained calm as she spoke to Morrison. "I need you to configure for landing. Gear down when I say, flaps to whatever position gives us the most control authority. We're going to come in fast and steep, but we're going to make it." She had performed similar emergency landings in combat, but never with civilian passengers, never with the weight of so many innocent lives in her hands. "Viper, how many times have you done this?" Morrison asked, his hands poised over the landing gear controls. She paused before answering, her eyes fixed on the horizon where Edwards Air Force Base was becoming visible. "Enough to know it's possible, Captain. Enough to know these people are going home tonight." The F-22s maintained their escort position as the 747 began its approach to Edwards. In the backseat of his Raptor, Captain Chen monitored the emergency frequencies, listening to the coordination between tower controllers, crash crews, and medical personnel. The largest rescue operation in Edwards' history was unfolding below them, all centered around the skill of one pilot who should have been reading a novel in seat 17A. Through the passenger windows, people could see the desert landscape of California spreading beneath them. Many had resigned themselves to death, but now they watched runways and buildings growing larger, the promise of solid ground replacing the terror of endless ocean. In seat 17A, an elderly man clutched his wife's hand and whispered, "Someone's flying this plane like they know what they're doing." Viper adjusted engine power again, feeling the aircraft respond to her inputs with mechanical obedience. The 747 was a wounded bird, but it was still flying, still fighting gravity through pure determination and precise control inputs. The runway at Edwards stretched out before them like a concrete lifeline, surrounded by emergency vehicles with flashing lights. Viper had landed on shorter runways in Afghanistan while taking enemy fire, but this approach felt different. These weren't soldiers who had accepted the risks of combat. These were families, children, people whose only crime was boarding an airplane in Los Angeles with dreams of reaching Tokyo. The weight of their trust pressed against her chest like a physical force. United 774, Edwards Tower. Runway 25 right cleared to land, winds calm, emergency equipment in position. The controller's voice carried professional calm, but Viper could hear the underlying tension. Everyone involved knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. A commercial airliner with complete flight control failure being flown by engine thrust alone. Edwards Tower, United 774. Beginning final approach. Advise all emergency personnel that we're coming in fast and steep. Landing will be firm but controlled. Viper reduced power to all engines simultaneously, feeling the aircraft's nose drop as they descended toward the runway threshold. Morrison watched the altimeter spin downward, 1,000 feet, 800, 600. Major Williams followed the approach from above, his F-22 providing real-time updates to Edwards Tower about the 747's condition. Tower, Razor 11. Aircraft appears stable, descent rate controlled, approaching runway centerline. He had escorted dozens of aircraft during his career, but never had he witnessed piloting skills like what he was observing. The wounded airliner was flying a textbook approach despite having no flight controls. In the cockpit, Viper's hands moved constantly between throttles, making minute adjustments to maintain their glide path. Her training kicked in with each control input. Muscle memory developed through thousands of hours of flight time, overriding the voice in her head that whispered about Lieutenant Hayes and the mountain ridge in Afghanistan. These people were counting on her, and failure was not acceptable. 500 feet on glide path, Morrison announced. Through the windscreen, the runway filled their entire view, concrete and painted lines rushing toward them at nearly 200 miles per hour. In the passenger cabin, people braced for impact, many praying to whatever deities they honored. Flight attendants shouted final instructions. Heads down, brace for landing. Viper's voice cut through the tension. Gear down now. Morrison dropped the landing gear, feeling the aircraft shudder as the massive wheels extended into the airstream. The added drag changed their descent profile, but Viper compensated instantly with power adjustments. 100 feet above the runway, she prepared for the most critical moments of the flight. 50 feet, looking good, Morrison called. The runway rushed beneath them, emergency vehicles racing alongside, ready to respond to whatever happened next. At 20 feet, Viper began reducing power to all engines, preparing to grease the landing of an aircraft that should have been impossible to fly. The main landing gear touched Edwards Air Force Base, runway 25 right with surprising gentleness, considering the circumstances. Viper immediately applied reverse thrust to all four engines, feeling the massive aircraft begin to decelerate. Morrison grabbed the wheel, but realized the nose-wheel steering was as useless as everything else. They were committed to whatever direction the aircraft chose. "Stay with the engines," Viper commanded, her hands dancing across the throttle quadrant to keep the 747 tracking down the runway centerline. The technique worked. Differential thrust steered them as effectively as any rudder system. Emergency vehicles followed alongside, crews ready to deploy foam or extract passengers, but the aircraft seemed to be under complete control. Captain Chen circled overhead in her F-22, providing commentary to Edwards Tower. Aircraft has touched down successfully, tracking centerline. Deceleration appears normal. Below her, she could see passengers pressed against windows, watching the desert landscape scroll past at decreasing speed. Many were crying, some laughing, all realizing they had just survived what should have been unsurvivable. 60 knots and decreasing, Morrison announced. The end of the runway approached, but their speed was dropping rapidly. Viper had calculated their stopping distance perfectly, accounting for the aircraft's weight, the desert temperature, and the runway's length. At 30 knots, she brought all engines to idle, allowing the 747 to coast to a complete stop 3,000 feet from the runway's end. The silence in the cockpit was profound. For the first time in 8 minutes, no engines were screaming, no warnings were sounding, no lives hung in the balance. Morrison stared at the young woman who had just performed a miracle, trying to process what he had witnessed. "Colonel, I've been flying for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like that." Viper's response was quiet, almost contemplative. "Neither have I, Captain." She began securing the engines according to shutdown procedures, her movements automatic despite the extraordinary circumstances. Through the cockpit windows, emergency crews surrounded the aircraft, their lights painting the desert in red and blue patterns. In the passenger cabin, people slowly realized they were safe. The elderly man in 17B looked toward the front of the aircraft and whispered to his wife, "Whoever was flying this plane just saved our lives." Flight attendants began the evacuation process, but passengers were in no hurry to leave. Many wanted to understand what had happened, who had brought them safely to Earth. Edwards Tower coordinated the ground response. United 774 emergency response complete. All passengers and crew safe. Outstanding work up there. The controller paused before adding, "Viper, that was some of the finest flying we've ever witnessed. Welcome to Edwards Air Force Base." Through her headset, Major Williams added his congratulations. "Viper, Razor Flight salutes you. Textbook emergency procedures executed flawlessly. You've got the respect of every pilot monitoring this frequency." Viper keyed her microphone one final time. "Edwards Tower, United 774 clear of runway. All souls safe." As emergency slides deployed and passengers began evacuating, word spread through Edwards Air Force Base about what had just occurred. The young woman who had been reading a novel in seat 17A had just performed one of the most remarkable emergency landings in aviation history. Her call sign would be spoken with reverence in pilot training programs for decades to come. But at that moment, she sat quietly in the right seat, remembering Lieutenant Hayes and wondering if he would have been proud. The debriefing room at Edwards Air Force Base buzzed with activity as investigators, airline officials, and Air Force personnel gathered around Viper. She sat calmly, still wearing her UCLA sweatshirt, looking more like a college student than the pilot who had just saved 412 lives. The contrast between her appearance and her extraordinary achievement fascinated everyone present. "Colonel Reeves, can you walk us through your decision-making process?" asked Captain Janet Torres, the lead Air Force investigator. The room fell silent as Viper organized her thoughts, her hands unconsciously mimicking the throttle movements she had used during the emergency. The aircraft exhibited classic symptoms of complete hydraulic failure. No flight control surfaces responding, but engines were producing normal power. Thrust differential was the only option for maintaining directional control. Her voice carried the same calm precision that had guided them safely to the ground. "The technique is taught in advanced emergency procedures, though typically for military aircraft with twin engines." Morrison nodded from across the room. He had already given his statement, describing how Viper had taken control with absolute confidence despite the impossible circumstances. "She flew that 747 like it was a fighter jet. I've never seen anything like the precision of her power adjustments." Major Williams entered the briefing room, having landed his F-22 shortly after the emergency was resolved. His presence drew attention. Few people had witnessed the entire event from beginning to end. "Colonel Reeves, I've been flying military aircraft for 12 years. What you accomplished up there defied everything we know about large aircraft emergency procedures." The Boeing technical representative, an engineer named David Park, consulted his notes before speaking. "According to our computer models, what you described should be impossible. A 747 with complete hydraulic failure cannot maintain controlled flight using only engine thrust." He paused, looking directly at Viper. "Yet here we are." "Computer models don't account for pilot skill," Viper replied simply. "They assume average response times, standard procedures, normal emotional states. None of those factors applied today." She stood and walked to a whiteboard, sketching the basic principles of thrust vectoring. "In combat, you learn that aircraft will do things beyond their design parameters if you understand their limits." The room watched as she explained the physics of her approach, the split-second timing required to maintain control, the mental calculations that allowed her to judge descent rates and approach angles without functional instruments. Her explanation was simultaneously technical and poetic, describing the marriage between human intuition and mechanical systems. "Where did you learn these techniques?" asked Torres. The question hung in the air, touching on subjects that Viper preferred not to discuss. She was quiet for several seconds before answering. Afghanistan. Sometimes aircraft come back damaged. Sometimes you have to land them anyway. Her voice carried a weight that spoke of experiences beyond textbooks and training simulations. Captain Chen, who had remained silent during most of the briefing, finally spoke. "Colonel, I've heard stories about your service record. The things pilots talk about in training programs." The room's attention shifted to Chen, sensing they were approaching something significant. "Is it true you once landed an F-16 with only one engine and damaged flight controls?" Viper's expression remained neutral, but those who knew how to read military bearing noticed the slight tension in her shoulders. "That's classified, Captain." Her response was professional, final, but it confirmed what many in the room had suspected. They were in the presence of someone whose skills went far beyond normal pilot training. The debriefing continued for another hour, covering technical details, emergency procedures, and lessons learned. Throughout the discussion, Viper answered questions with precision and humility, never suggesting that what she had accomplished was anything more than applied training and experience. But everyone present understood they had witnessed something extraordinary. As the formal session concluded, Morrison approached her privately. "Colonel, I need to know something. When you took those controls, were you confident we'd make it?" Viper considered the question carefully before answering. "Captain, confidence is a luxury. I was determined. There's a difference." She paused, looking through the briefing room windows toward the runway where their aircraft still sat surrounded by investigators. 412 people were counting on me. Failure wasn't an option, so I didn't consider it. Her words captured the essence of military mindset, the ability to compartmentalize doubt and focus entirely on mission success. Morrison realized he had just learned something profound about the nature of heroism and the people who rise to impossible challenges. Outside the briefing room, news crews were setting up equipment, alerted by aviation enthusiasts who monitored emergency frequencies. The story was already spreading across social media. A mysterious passenger had saved a doomed flight using skills that seemed almost superhuman. But the woman at the center of the story was nowhere to be found. Word of the emergency landing spread through aviation communities worldwide within hours. Flight instructors pulled up radar tracks and radio transcripts, studying every detail of Viper's approach. Commercial pilots discussed the impossibility of what she had accomplished, while military aviators nodded with understanding born of similar experiences in combat zones. At the Air Force Academy, Brigadier General Patricia Kane read the preliminary reports with growing amazement. She remembered Lieutenant Alexandra Reeves from her time as a cadet. Brilliant, fearless, possessed of natural flying ability that instructors called once in a generation. The young woman who had struggled with the social aspects of military life had become exactly what Kane had predicted, an extraordinary pilot whose skills transcended normal training. "Get me everything on Colonel Reeves' service record," Kane told her aide, "and find out why one of our most talented pilots is flying commercial to Tokyo instead of leading fighter squadrons." The answer to that question would reveal a story of loss, guilt, and redemption that would change how the Air Force thought about pilot retention and mental health support. In the Edwards Officers Club that evening, pilots gathered to discuss the day's events. Major Williams held court, describing the view from his F-22 as the crippled airliner made its approach. She flew that 747 like it was an extension of her will. Every power adjustment was perfect, every correction precisely timed. Captain Chen added her perspective. "The radio communications were what impressed me most. No panic, no uncertainty, just professional competence under impossible pressure." The assembled pilots nodded, recognizing the description of someone operating at the highest levels of pilot skill. But one question remained unanswered. Where was Colonel Alexandra "Viper" Reeves? She had completed her debriefing, provided contact information to investigators, and then quietly disappeared. Her rental car was gone from the Edwards parking lot, her destination unknown. The woman who had saved 412 lives had vanished as mysteriously as she had appeared. The answer lay in a small motel room in Barstow, California, where Viper sat on the edge of a bed, staring at her cell phone. She had 17 missed calls from reporters, 12 from Air Force personnel, and 1 from her father. The text messages ranged from congratulatory to demanding interviews. She ignored them all, her mind processing the events of the day. For the first time since Lieutenant Hayes' death, she had felt the pure joy of flying, the satisfaction of pushing aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits and succeeding. The guilt that had driven her from the Air Force felt less crushing, replaced by the memory of 412 voices saying, "Thank you," as they evacuated the aircraft. She picked up her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Dad, it's Alex." Her father's voice was warm, proud, and completely unsurprised by what she had accomplished. "I saw the news, sweetheart. I always knew you couldn't stay away from flying." "I think," she said quietly, "I might be ready to come home." The Boeing 747 sat under floodlights on Edwards Air Force Base, surrounded by investigators and engineers trying to understand exactly how complete hydraulic failure had occurred. The aircraft would eventually be repaired and returned to service, but it would forever be known as the plane that Viper landed. Mechanics working on the hydraulic systems spoke in hushed tones about the pilot who had accomplished the impossible. Meanwhile, social media exploded with fragments of the story. Passengers posted photos from inside the aircraft during the emergency, describing the moment when panic had transformed into hope. Flight 17A passenger Marcus Chen wrote on Twitter, "A young woman saved our lives today. Don't know her name, but she flew like an angel." The post would be shared 30,000 times. Aviation bloggers worked feverishly to piece together the technical details, creating animated simulations of thrust-only flight control. YouTube videos analyzing the radar tracks garnered millions of views, with commenters debating the physics and piloting skills required. But the central figure remained mysterious, identified only by her call sign and her extraordinary achievement. At Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, Colonel Richard Torch Morrison was reviewing pilot assignment rosters when his aide handed him the Edwards incident report. Morrison had been Viper's squadron commander in Afghanistan, the officer who had recommended her for promotion, and defended her during the investigation into Lieutenant Hayes' death. Reading the technical details of her civilian emergency landing, he felt a mixture of pride and regret. "Sir, there's been some media interest in Colonel Reeves' background," the aide reported. "Should we prepare an official statement?" Morrison considered the question carefully. Viper had left the Air Force to escape attention and pressure. The last thing she needed was renewed scrutiny of her military service. "Official position is that personnel records are confidential. We don't comment on individual service members." Morrison's voice carried finality, but privately, he was already planning to reach out to his former pilot. If she was ready to return to flying, the Air Force needed her skills more than ever. The story continued to evolve as passengers from United 774 gave interviews to news outlets. They described the transformation in the aircraft's behavior, the sense that someone exceptionally skilled had taken control. Many specifically mentioned seeing a young woman walking toward the cockpit just before the situation stabilized. Dr. Sarah Kim, an aeronautical engineer from UCLA who had been traveling to a conference in Tokyo, provided technical commentary to aviation magazines. "What this pilot accomplished violates conventional wisdom about large aircraft handling. She essentially turned a passenger airliner into a thrust-vectored aircraft through pure skill and timing." The phrase thrust-vectored aircraft became a trending topic as aviation enthusiasts explained the concept to curious observers. The general public began to understand that they had witnessed something genuinely unprecedented, a feat of piloting that would be studied and admired for decades. At Edwards Air Force Base, the tower controller who had handled the emergency landing found himself the center of attention among his colleagues. Her voice never changed, he told them. From initial contact to final taxi, she sounded like she was conducting routine training flights. Absolutely no indication of stress or uncertainty. Major Williams submitted his after-action report, emphasizing Viper's professionalism and extraordinary skill. Recommend Colonel Reeves for appropriate recognition, he concluded. Her actions reflect the highest traditions of military aviation and saved numerous civilian lives. The report would work its way up the chain of command, eventually reaching the Pentagon. By evening, Viper was trending on social media platforms worldwide, though the actual identity of the mysterious pilot remained protected. Aviation communities shared stories of legendary pilots throughout history, placing the Edwards emergency landing alongside the most celebrated achievements in flight. In Barstow, Viper finally returned her father's call. Retired Air Force Colonel James Reeves had been following the news coverage, his pride in his daughter mixing with concern for her well-being. "Alex, the whole aviation world is talking about what you did today." "I just did what any pilot would do, Dad." Her voice was thoughtful, processing the day's events and their implications. But for the first time since Afghanistan, flying felt right again. "Come home, sweetheart. The Air Force needs pilots like you." Colonel Reeves had spent 30 years in service, rising through the ranks of fighter aviation. He understood talent when he saw it, and he knew his daughter possessed skills that shouldn't be wasted in civilian exile. Viper stared out the motel window at the desert landscape, the same terrain she had flown over countless times during training exercises. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to continue her journey to Tokyo and anonymity, or return to the life she had tried to leave behind. The choice would define not just her future, but potentially the future of military aviation. The phone rang again. This time it was Colonel Morrison from Nellie's. "Viper, we need to talk." The conversation that followed would change everything, as her former commander laid out a proposal that would allow her to return to flying while addressing the guilt that had driven her from service. The Air Force was developing new emergency response protocols, training programs based on real-world scenarios. They needed someone with both the technical expertise and practical experience to lead the initiative. It would mean helping other pilots handle impossible situations, Morrison explained, teaching them the skills that saved 400 people today. The assignment would be redemption and purpose combined, a chance to honor Lieutenant Hayes' memory by ensuring future pilots survived similar circumstances. As Viper listened to the proposal, she felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the guilt that had constrained her for months. Perhaps there was a way forward that honored both her losses and her gifts, a path that led back to the sky. 3 days later, the aviation world received another surprise when a brief Air Force statement announced that Colonel Alexandra Reeves had accepted assignment as director of the new Advanced Emergency Procedures Training Center at Edwards Air Force Base. The program would teach military and civilian pilots the techniques needed to handle catastrophic failures, using the Edwards incident as a foundational case study. Major Williams was among the first volunteers for the program, eager to learn from someone whose skills had been proven under the ultimate pressure. "If Viper is teaching, I'm learning," he told his squadron commander. The sentiment was echoed throughout the military aviation community, where her call sign had become synonymous with exceptional piloting under impossible circumstances. The first class would begin in 6 months, giving Viper time to develop curriculum and settle into her new role. But first, she had one more flight to complete, delivering the repaired Boeing 747 back to United Airlines. The aircraft had been restored to full operational status, its hydraulic systems completely overhauled. The company wanted their most experienced captain to perform the delivery flight, But Captain Morrison had a different suggestion. "Let Viper fly it home," he told the United chief pilot. "That aircraft owes its existence to her. She should be the one to return it to service." The request was unprecedented, allowing a military pilot to conduct a civilian delivery flight, but the circumstances were equally unprecedented. On a clear morning in November, Viper walked across Edwards Air Force Base toward the waiting 747, now painted in fresh United colors with a small placard near the door commemorating the emergency landing. Captain Morrison would serve as co-pilot, but they both understood this was her flight, her moment to close the circle on the most challenging day of her career. The engine started normally, all systems showing green indications. During taxi, Morrison handled radio communications while Viper focused on the aircraft's behavior, checking that all flight controls responded properly. The same runway where she had performed an impossible landing now stretched ahead, offering a conventional departure. "Edwards Tower, United Special Flight 1 ready for takeoff," Morrison announced. The response came with obvious emotion. "United Special 1, Edwards Tower. Wind calm, runway 25 right cleared for takeoff. It's been an honor hosting you, Viper." She advanced the throttles, feeling 4 engines respond with smooth power increases. The 747 accelerated down the runway that had witnessed her greatest achievement, lifting off into the morning sky with routine grace. Below, emergency crews who had responded to the crisis watched the departure, many snapping photos of the aircraft that had made their base famous. During the flight to Los Angeles, Morrison observed Viper's interaction with the aircraft systems. Her movements were confident but reverent, treating the repaired airliner with the respect due a machine that had trusted her with the lives of its passengers. She flew the approach to LAX with textbook precision, greeting the California morning with a landing so gentle it barely registered on the shock struts. At the gate, United Airlines personnel waited to receive their aircraft and honor the woman who had saved it. But Viper had already arranged for private transportation back to Edwards, avoiding the ceremony and media attention. Her role in this story was complete. The future lay in teaching others to handle similar challenges. That evening, she stood in the empty classroom where she would soon train the next generation of pilots in advanced emergency procedures. The walls would hold photographs of notable aviation achievements, case studies of successful emergency landings, and technical diagrams of flight control systems. But the centerpiece would be a simple placard, dedicated to Lieutenant Michael Hayes and all aviators who gave their lives in service. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Proud of you, sweetheart. Mom would be too." Colonel Reeves had lost his wife to cancer when Viper was in high school, but he knew she would have been amazed by their daughter's journey from tragedy to redemption. The Advanced Emergency Procedures Training Center would open with great fanfare, drawing students from military services worldwide. But its true success would be measured in lives saved by pilots who learned to push beyond conventional limitations, who understood that impossible situations required extraordinary responses, and who carried with them the example of a young woman who turned her greatest loss into her greatest gift. The legend of Viper would grow with each graduating class, each emergency successfully handled by pilots trained in her techniques. But the woman herself would find satisfaction in quieter moments, watching students master difficult procedures, receiving reports of successful emergency landings, and knowing that Lieutenant Hayes' sacrifice had ultimately saved hundreds of lives through the skills she developed in grief and perfected in service. 1 year later, the techniques taught at Edwards had been credited with saving 3 commercial aircraft and dozens of military flights. The thrust differential procedures developed by Viper became standard training in pilot programs globally. Aviation safety statistics showed measurable improvements in emergency landing success rates, a tribute to the woman who had refused to let tragedy define her limits. Captain Morrison retired from commercial aviation and joined the training center as senior instructor, working alongside Viper to share decades of experience with new generations of pilots. Their partnership represented the best of both military and civilian aviation, practical knowledge combined with academic rigor. Major Williams, now lieutenant,